Lecture 44, William Shakespeare, Hamlet.
In this lecture, we'll take a careful look at Hamlet, which Shakespeare probably wrote in 1600, arguably Shakespeare's best-known play, unarguably a very great tragedy. There are many ways of looking at this play, and it's a play of huge complexity. What we'll try to do in this lecture is to enter the play by looking at the same elements of theatricality that we looked at in the last lecture on Merchant of Venice. If Merchant of Venice ends in the most characteristic way a comedy can, which is to say with the celebration of several marriages, Hamlet ends with corpses piled from floor to ceiling. Hamlet is dead. Claudius is dead. Queen Gertrude is dead. Ophelia is dead, Hamlet's girlfriend. Her brother Laertes and her father Polonius are dead. And of course, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Well, how did we get there? Drama, a one-word definition, drama is conflict. And it's hard to find a better conflict in all of drama than that between Claudius and Hamlet. Claudius is king of Denmark, who has just taken over, and he has married the former queen on the death of old Hamlet. He gives a wonderfully convincing speech in Act 1, Scene 2, in front of all of the nobles of Denmark, explaining how he did this and why he did this. This was, of course, in the best interests of Denmark. What is sort of interesting about this speech is that it shows very good policy. What folks knew in Shakespeare's time is that in any political realm, the most difficult time for them is between rulers. An old ruler dies, you better get somebody in there pretty quickly or else things are going to fall apart. And so what Claudius does is explain to the assembled court that this seemed to him to be the best course of action precisely because it kept that interregnum period. In fact, it made it practically non-existent. And so what he does is he explains how marriage to the former queen was not really a matter of personal choice so much as a politically appropriate thing to do. And he says that what we've done thereby is kept the kingdom strong and gives some examples of good statecraft to prove this. And he does a really terrific job of convincing everybody of this, with the exception of Hamlet. Hamlet is brooding over this situation. Now, what's, I think, most interesting about this is that here's Hamlet, son of the dead king, who by logic, by what you would expect, ought to be the new king. I mean, that's the way it works. A king dies, kingdom goes to his son. Hamlet's away at the university at this time. By the time he's back, it's a done deal. But the interesting thing is that Hamlet seems to be at the beginning of the play brooding a whole lot more about the hasty marriage of his mother than about the fact that he's out of a job, that he ought to be king now. And in fact, it's not until much later in the play that he begins to make any kind of noise about how the throne ought rightfully to be his. So what's kind of interesting then is that you see somebody who's very suspicious, who realizes that Claudius is not all that he seems to be, but it's got a lot more to do with family situations than with dynastic ones. In Shakespeare, especially in the tragedies, those two come together, but we don't really get to see that so much right at the very beginning of Hamlet. Well, Claudius, on the other hand, treats Hamlet with great suspicion. Of course, the key to all of this, we learn it later explicitly, but anybody looking at the play already knows it in advance, is that in fact he got to the throne by killing the old king, and he married as much because he was in love with the queen, in lust with the queen, than because this was a matter of good policy. So there's an underlying current here, a kind of demonstration of the greatest of all Shakespearean themes, the difference between things as they appear and things as they really are beneath the surface. But at this point, Hamlet himself doesn't know this. Nonetheless, Claudius is very suspicious of Hamlet and treats him with a great deal of care. It's almost as though Claudius had been reading his Machiavelli, who says, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. So Hamlet, he wants to go back to the university. Claudius says, no, I can't do that. Your mom wouldn't like it very much. And what he does is he sends a whole bunch of people out to spy on Hamlet. One of the questions that I ask when I teach the play, I ask my students, what do most of the people spend their time doing in Hamlet? I think the answer is they spend their time spying on somebody else. And this sort of gives you a little peek about what life is like at the top of the food chain. It certainly tells you about what court is like. It certainly helps to explain why Hamlet is sort of in a desperate situation. But it also helps to establish what the other characters are up to. There's Polonius, who is one of the courtiers, an advisor to the king, and he is more than happy to spy on Hamlet. His job is made a little bit easier because his daughter is Hamlet's girlfriend, and he sort of presses her into service. That doesn't make her job any easier, needless to say. Old school buddies of Hamlet are pressed into service. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Find out what's turning him into this brooding guy. Find out what's sitting in his heart. Meanwhile, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears and tells Hamlet that he has been murdered. And, for good measure, he demands revenge. Now, ghosts are problematic characters under the best of circumstances, and Shakespeare does everything he can to keep it that way. Everything about the ghost is problematic. First thing that's problematic, is the ghost real? Well, it would seem to be a slam dunk in favor of yes to that question because other people see this ghost. It's not simply a figment of Hamlet's imagination because he's not the only one to see it. But there's another scene when the ghost appears to Hamlet and Hamlet is the only one who sees it. So at least there's a little tiny bit of ambiguity there about the second appearance of the ghost, if not the first. Second question, is the ghost telling the truth when he tells Hamlet the story of his own murder and of the usurpation of both his throne and his wife by his nasty brother? Well, we have independent testimony that he is telling the truth. There's corroboration because later in the play, Claudius himself confesses to this. Claudius is praying, or better yet, not praying, trying to pray, talks a little bit about the fact that if he were truly repentant, he would have to give up the queen, the throne, his own ambition, and he says, nope, not going to do that. So we find out that everything the ghost says is true. The problem is that Hamlet doesn't get to overhear that conversation. So the ghost's words to Hamlet remain very problematic because Hamlet needs to have some kind of corroboration. Later in the play, when Hamlet figures out the way to do this, he says, okay, I'm going to find out whether he's telling the truth or not by putting on a little play that will test the conscience of the king. In other words, what Hamlet decides to do to find out whether or not he should follow the ghost's advice. After all, revenge is a really problematic thing. And in fact, whether or not revenge is the right course of action remains problematic in the play. Hamlet accepts his task, right? Not everybody gets a command from a ghost, but his famous hesitation, the thing that he's sort of most known for in criticism, might well be in some ways connected to the complexities of the problem that he's dealing with. The play itself, it seems to me, doesn't necessarily accept an ethic of revenge as being appropriate. Because, of course, the problem with revenge is it always leads to further revenge. There's no way of stopping the cycle. And it seems to me that just the very setting of the play brings this out. It's Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Denmark is really England a long time ago and far away because, of course, it was from Denmark that the Anglo-Saxons came over to England in the 4th and 5th centuries and settled there. So in many ways, in looking at old Denmark, they're really looking at an earlier version of themselves. But of course, an earlier version when they were still pagans. Pagans, especially those Anglo-Saxon folks, accepted an ethic of revenge, but Christians in Shakespeare's time had a real problem with it. Well, which of those two ethics really apply? That's very problematic and is never resolved. And one of the things that's very interesting is that you have all of these references to old Denmark at the same time that you have the modern Christian references that you would expect in a play that was written and produced in 1600. So what Hamlet needs, corroboration. How is he going to get it? And he decides that the best way to go about his business is to do to others what they're doing to him. If this is a play that's all about spying, that's what most of the people are doing most of the time, Hamlet, who is, in the modern phrase, wicked smart, Claudius never really doubts that for a minute, nor does Hamlet deny that Claudius is a very smart guy. This is another thing that makes this such a very interesting conflict. Hamlet, he knows that he's being spied on. And in fact, a lot of his rhetoric really makes a lot more sense if we see that he realizes this. The way he talks is the way he talks because he knows he's on stage. He knows that there are people there who are looking out after him. Well, one question to ask then is, for Hamlet, what weapons does he have in order to fight back? Claudius has, again to use a modern phrase, home field advantage here. Hamlet, a student. We find out late in the play that Hamlet is probably 30 years old. That means an advanced graduate student, somebody who's been hanging out at the university for a very long time, somebody who is not simply a brooding intellectual by temperament, but he's a brooding intellectual because that's what you do at a university, for crying out loud. Well, on Claudius's home territory, what advantages does Hamlet have? Claudius has the whole apparatus of the state, so to speak. If he tells Polonius, spy on Hamlet, Polonius is eager to do it, happy to suck up. Okay? But what does Hamlet have? Well, his first weapon seems a little bit weird on the surface. It's madness, craziness. Hamlet decides, as soon as he sees the ghost, that he's going to play the part of the madman. Now, this makes a certain amount of tactical sense. You've just found out that your uncle has killed your father and married your mother. It's going to be hard to sit at the dinner table and say, pass the butter. Okay? So madness as just a kind of tactical strategy makes a certain amount of sense. And yet, the interesting thing is, again, lots of folks disagree about whether and where this takes place. Is Hamlet pretending to be mad, or at a certain point does he cross over the line? Is he playing the game, or is the game playing him? Nonetheless, at least as he first takes it on, madness is a weapon for him in his fight against Claudius. His second weapon is he's going to put on a play. Or to put it another way, Hamlet's weapon is the theater itself. We talked all about the theatricality of disguise when looking at comedy and The Merchant of Venice in the last lecture. Here, theatricality presents itself in one very obvious way. At the dead bang center of Hamlet is the play within a play that Hamlet has actors put on in order to test the conscience of Claudius. Hamlet's theory is this: if you put on a play that reenacts the murder of his father, it's going to so get to Claudius's conscience that Claudius is going to give his hand away. Let's think about that. For a long, long time, I used to think this, that if Hamlet believes that putting on a play is a good way of spying on Claudius, a way of kind of evening the playing field, he's been hanging out too long with the Dramaramas at Wittenberg, his university. I no longer think that. Or I no longer think that that's the whole story. Because if I'm right about what we've been saying the last couple of lectures about the power of theater, it seems to me that no one would be so up in arms about it. Nobody would be screaming blasphemy. Nobody would be saying this is a contested space. Nobody would be saying close the damn theaters down if they didn't think it had a great deal of power. And it seems to me that in some ways, the power of the theater is accepted both by its friends, and who is a better friend than Shakespeare himself, and by its enemies. And I think that in some ways this is reflected in the play within a play that takes place in Hamlet. In order to try and illustrate this a little bit more, I want to try and make the point that what takes place in this play within a play reaches outward to many of the other key and central moments in the play that we call Hamlet. In other words, that the play within a play represents a kind of mirror of the play Hamlet, as Hamlet itself is a kind of mirror of larger issues and concerns of life. And to do this, I want to read a speech that Hamlet gives in Act 3, Scene 2. Another one of the things that I tell my folks when we're in Shakespeare is a kind of key to what's going on, a way to understanding Shakespeare better, is to cut to the chase, is very often to cut to the center of any play. Show me what's going on in the actual middle of the play, and you will see what the major concerns of the play are. It's usually, almost always, Act 3, Scene 2. Show me what's going on in Act 3, Scene 2. I don't say this. Don't read the rest of the play. That's enough. No. What I do say is see how it reflects out. And in Act 3, Scene 2, among other things, what Hamlet is doing is giving advice to the players on how they are best to perform their little play in the presence of Claudius and the rest of the court. Now, again, I think that the reason that Hamlet is so careful in giving his advice is that he recognizes that Claudius is no dummy. And so therefore, in order for his little play to be effective, it has to be very well acted. Well, notice, of course, that that really is a kind of neat mirror of a playwright, say, Shakespeare, say, thinking about what's necessary to succeed theatrically. I think a lot of criticism sort of assumes that most of Shakespeare's audience was made up of dummies, and that's why they're all so many, low puns and all that kind of stuff. Nonsense. Shakespeare understood that you can only have good plays if you have good audiences. And so there's a kind of neat reflection here in what's going on in the larger issues of Shakespearean theater. In any case, let's take a look at the beginning of Act 3, Scene 2, which is the speech to the players that Hamlet gives. Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of our players do, I had as lief the town crier spoke my lines. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hand thus, but use all gently. For in the very torrent, tempest, and, as I may say, whirlwind of passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Oh, it offends me to the soul to hear a robustious, periwig-pated fellow tear a passion to tatters, to very rags, to split the ears of the groundlings, who are, for the most part, capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. I would have such a fellow whipped for o'erdoing termagant. It out Herods Herod, pray you, avoid it. This is a neat take on Hamlet himself, the character, because it's one of the few times when we see him, when he's not sort of brooding, when he's not the world's most tortured and sensitive English major with a philosophy minor in history. He seems to be naturally at home with these folks, and it's a worthy companion piece to all of the to-bes and not-to-bes, and to the, oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I speeches. But if we take a closer look at what the advice is, I think that that is equally revealing. His advice is, above all, to be natural. Now, it seems to me that, again, for obvious reasons, this is good advice because Claudius is no dummy. What you see on stage has got to look natural or else it's not going to work. But, and in fact, one could say it works. The people on stage do their job, or at least so it seems, because at the appropriate point, Claudius gets up screaming and leaves. whatever else you want to make of that, Hamlet thinks that this is a clue that he's headed in the right direction. But let's look at it from a slightly different point of view. What if this advice is applied to the other actors, not in the play within a play, but in the larger play, Hamlet itself? In particular, let's take a look at this advice and apply it to the character of Hamlet himself and see how good a job he does at taking his own advice. There's really good reason for doing this. It goes all the way back, I think, to the tradition of Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, it's very often the case, most often the case, that take a tragic hero, look at their lines carefully, they turn out to be the best predictors of their own fate. It's not something imposed on them, it's something that comes from them. So Creon in Antigone says, show me the man who can rule his family well, I'll show you somebody fit to rule his state, at the very moment when his family is collapsing and his state collapses soon after. Hamlet here is saying, be natural. Well, let's talk about all of the ways in which Hamlet, in fact, is anything but. One of the things that's sort of interesting is that when he says, in the very torrent, tempest, and, as I may say, whirlwind of passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. That doesn't exactly seem to be what Hamlet is doing when he's playing the part of the madman. And whether or not he crosses over the line, there are all of these very interesting places where his own language gets so out of control that instead of concealing what's going on, he kind of gives his hand away to Claudius. Let there be no more marriages. All that are married, except one, shall live. You got anybody in mind here, Hamlet? I mean, this is, if you want to sort of give Claudius reason for being even more suspicious, Hamlet's own words, in the throes of his own pretend madness, seem to do it. But even better than that, there's a line in this speech to the players where he says, don't saw the air too much with your hand thus. Well, Hamlet saws the air too much with his hand thus when he almost randomly takes out his sword, sticks it through the curtain, and kills not Claudius, as he hoped against hope it might be, but randomly Polonius, doing his thing, hiding behind a curtain, spying on Hamlet. Hamlet's in the room with his mother. He does it, wham, Polonius is dead. And all of a sudden, things change pretty radically. What changes? Well, the first thing that changes, of course, is that this gives Claudius the opportunity he wants to sort of make his plan very specific for getting rid of Hamlet. Second thing that it does, he has just killed not only a courtier, a sort of key man in the administration, he's just killed his girlfriend's father. Well, there are a lot of reasons that Ophelia goes mad, but seeing your boyfriend kill your father is sort of top among them. And it's very interesting, if you want to sort of think about this play in terms of what we said about double plotting, that you have things taking place in the Hamlet family and then things in the sort of Polonius-Ophelia family that mirror each other. Hamlet's pretend madness, Ophelia really does go mad. Or Hamlet has to avenge the death of his father. Hamlet kills Polonius, so Polonius' son Laertes has to kill Hamlet. And that's another very interesting plot line that is developed, a kind of relationship between two plots, but something where Hamlet's careless use of his hands, his not being natural, his not following his own advice about what works, really does him in, because, of course, from now on, Laertes is a kind of pawn for Claudius in his plan to kill Hamlet. In other words, killing Polonius sets in motion the chain of events that leads to everybody's death, including Hamlet himself. The double plotting really becomes quite specific at this point. Now, let's back up a little bit and ask sort of the large question about the tragedy of Hamlet. We started out by saying that it's a tragedy because everybody is dead at the end, and we know that's what tragedy is all about. But the tragedy in Hamlet, it seems to me, insofar as it's the tragedy of the character of Hamlet, is that we see thereby that Hamlet begins playing by Claudius's own rules, and to the extent that he does that, he becomes no better than Claudius. And you could argue at the end of the play that he is responsible for as many deaths as Claudius is. It seems to me that the tragedy of Hamlet is somebody who is playing by rules that he really never should have played by in the first place. Okay? One of the ways that I make this clear to my students is that I ask them, if you had to be a subject, all right, something's rotten in the state of Denmark, but let's suppose that you had to be a citizen there, who would you rather have as your king? Would you rather have Claudius? Would you rather have Hamlet? Me, I'd take Claudius any day of the week. It seems to me that you could argue for the fact that he's not the ideal king, but you could argue for the fact that Hamlet is very ill-suited for the job. Okay? Now, we've talked a lot about this in personal terms, and we've talked a lot about it in terms of the two plots, but I think it's also worth saying something about it in political terms, in terms of sort of a larger political issue. Shakespeare is very good at tying up his plays at the end. It's kind of like the end of a Beethoven symphony. You really know when it's over, and there's really a sort of wonderful climax. Well, something like that, I think, happens at the end of Hamlet. A lot of deaths in the last scene. Recall that what happens is that there is this duel, poison swords and all of that, and a poison cup. So that means there's a lot of opportunity for mayhem. And in one final scene, Laertes and Hamlet kill each other because they exchange swords, one of which has a poison tip. Gertrude drinks from the poison cup, which was intended as a security blanket in case the poisoned sword didn't work by Claudius. Right? Hamlet figures out what's going on, forces Claudius to drink so that he dies, too. So you got Laertes, Hamlet, Gertrude, Claudius, all dead, adding to the corpses that are already there. By this time, everybody else is dead as well. Who's left? Nobody's left, except for Hamlet's buddy Horatio, and for a guy named Fortinbras, who is the nephew of the King of Norway. If you go back to the very beginning of Hamlet, Claudius is giving this speech to his nobles, and he's saying, look, it's not just theoretical, guys. The reason that we had to unite the country was that there was a real threat out there. You'll recall that under old Hamlet, we got some land from Norway. Well, the nephew to the King of Norway, he's now trying to get that land back. So I consolidated things very, very quickly. I told him, don't mess with us. We've got an army ready. We've got a king sitting on the throne. But in addition to the stick, I also gave him a carrot. I said, you've got this army. You're ready. Here's the deal. You leave us alone, and we will give you a Ural pass that will allow you to go right through Denmark on your way to conquer somebody else. Norway, Denmark, why don't you go to Poland? That would be a really neat place. And in fact, Hamlet is, in some ways, the poor Polish don't come out very well in this play. Fortinbras is mentioned at the beginning. In the middle of the play, his armies are on the way to Poland, gives Hamlet a chance to sort of meditate on the craziness of the human condition. They're all going over to fight for a piece of land which is not big enough to bury the dead on. And then, interestingly enough, what happens is this. At the very end of the play, Fortinbras is coming back from Poland, and he stops to sort of pay his respects to the folks in Denmark. And he walks in, and he sees the pile of corpses, and they say, guess what? You are the new king of Denmark. Well, I don't think it's been sufficiently sort of noticed. I don't think people have reflected enough on the fact that this is not only Fortinbras's lucky day, but what it means is that the whole sort of Machiavellian enterprise of statecraft that Claudius began and that Hamlet sort of jumped into has as its final goal exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do in the beginning. That at the very beginning, we're trying to keep him from getting just the little tiniest piece of Denmark, don't want him to add to his territories. At the end, he takes over the whole enchilada. And it seems to me that what it's saying is that if you're playing by those rules, that's what's going to happen. That the kind of statecraft that Claudius practices, kind of statecraft that looks like he was reading Machiavelli nightly for 43 years in a row, it only works if you're the only one who plays that way. But in Hamlet, Hamlet plays by Machiavelli's rules, and at the end, you see the results.